I'll just wait until we see that most of the people have arrived. Just to let everyone who has already arrived know, we're just waiting for everyone else to come into the virtual space, and we'll be beginning very shortly. Good morning, Tony. Good morning, Abby. Thank you for your kind words. Good morning, Kelly, and good morning, Westwood. Christine, I'm sorry that you have an echo. We're not hearing it from our end. It may be your own computer. And thank you to Niigaan School that you're bringing along with you. Well, I think we'll get started. So good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, I would like to welcome you all to our Holocaust and Human Rights Symposium. It has been 20 years since our first symposium. And of course, we wish that we could be meeting together in person, but due to the many challenges that COVID presented, we decided to go virtual this year. And we're glad that so many educators responded, representing about 55 schools, and that you're bringing your students with you to this virtual event today. And we're also pleased to welcome the general public for the very first time. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Grossberg Endowment Fund at the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba, the Asper Foundation, and the Azrieli Foundation. We are also grateful to the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg for their year-round support. And thank you to the Holocaust Education Committee of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada and to the staff. I would like to acknowledge that this event is being live streamed from ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We recognize the historical fact emphasized by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and as acknowledged by the Government of Canada, that the Canadian government and various religious and secular organizations that predate the country perpetuated a genocide against the Indigenous peoples, and that elements of that genocide continue to the present day. We affirm that our commitment to never forget must also include confronting attempts to destroy Indigenous culture and nationhood and condemn attempts to deny that historical reality. Since our last symposium in March of 2020, our world has been upended. With the necessary degree of isolation that COVID brought with it, many of the most vulnerable in our community found themselves alone at the very time that anti-Semitic rhetoric and distortion boiled over. Comparisons of the necessary health restrictions were made by some to the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust. Symbols such as the yellow star and the Nazi swastika appeared at public protests, of the very restrictions put in place to protect us. We have witnessed an explosion of racism. Those whose worldview is inspired by an echo chamber of hateful beliefs and conspiracy theories have sown division and threatened the very fabric of our democratic institutions. Halfway across the globe, an evil tyrant has unleashed a war that we did not expect to see in our lifetime. And once again, the phrase never again rings hollow, and instead, ever again more accurately describes the reality of the multiplicity of genocides since the end of World War II. We remember too that today marks 28 years since the beginning of the Rwandan genocide that resulted in the death of as many as 800,000 people, mostly of the Tutsi minority. And that at the time, the world didn't seem to notice the bloodbath and preferred to look away. Today, many countries in the world have responded to the illegal war in Ukraine with practical aid and an embrace of refugees, as it should be. However, many of these same countries continue to have a very different attitude when it comes to refugees from Africa or the Near East. We also continue to witness the mistreatment of the Roma people. The past 2 years have brought to our attention the many unmarked graves of Indigenous children on the grounds of former residential schools across the country. It is a moment of reckoning. These burial sites are not really discoveries, at least not to the Indigenous and Métis communities. And certainly when I went to school, we did not learn anything about this stain on Canada's history. Our textbooks ignored the residential schools, which at the time were still in operation. Today, there is an opportunity for Canadians to reflect on what reconciliation really means and what each and every one of us needs to do to achieve it. It is now my honor to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Karlee Sapoznik Evans, who in turn will introduce you to our honored speakers. Dr. Karlee Sapoznik Evans is a long-standing social justice and human rights advocate and researcher. She was named one of CBC Manitoba's Future 40 Under 40 and has served as part of reconciliation, anti-slavery, genocide prevention, social justice, and human rights initiatives across Canada in Sierra Leone, Mali, Peru, Italy, England, Spain, Poland, Ukraine, Israel, and the United States. From 2014 to 2015, she led a team of researchers for Library and Archives Canada's Document Disclosure Project for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Her research on historical and contemporary slavery, including human trafficking, helped to inform Canada's Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. She earned her PhD in history at York University and has expertise as a professor at L'Université de Saint-Boniface and at the University of Winnipeg. Since 2018, she has overseen a team of researchers and policy analysts within Manitoba's civil service, conducting work focused on the human rights and best interests of children, youth, young adults, and families. And Karlee is a member of our Holocaust Education Committee.
Thank you, Belle. Hello, bonjour, welcome everyone. Bienvenue à tous. Thank you for joining us today for the 20th Annual Holocaust and Human Rights Education Symposium. If you have any questions for today's guests, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box for them to answer at the end of the formal moderated portion of this morning's event. It's now my sincere honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. Stefan Carter was born and grew up in Warsaw, Poland, and as a teenager survived the horrors of the Second World War. He emigrated to Winnipeg in 1948, where he enrolled in medicine. After postgraduate studies at the Mayo Clinic and Cornell Medical Center in New York, he married Emily Horn, a teacher and artist from New York, and returned to Winnipeg to join the Faculty of Medicine. He became a professor of physiology and medicine. For more than 40 years, Dr. Carter taught cardiovascular function and combined his faculty position at the University of Manitoba with clinical work and research in cardiovascular disease at St. Boniface General Hospital. His other interests include his family with 2 sons, a palliative medicine physician, and an artist and physical therapist. He is also interested in music and has been talking to high school and university students about tolerance in the context of his experiences during the Holocaust of World War II. Niigaan Sinclair is Anishinaabe, St. Peter's Little Peguis, and a professor at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Faculty of Arts Professorship in Indigenous Knowledge and Aesthetics, and is currently head of the Department of Indigenous Studies. Niigaan is also an award-winning writer, editor, and activist who was recently named to the Power List by Maclean's magazine as one of the most influential individuals in Canada. In 2018, he won Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his bi-weekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press, and he is a featured member of the Friday Power panel on CBC's Power and Politics. A former secondary school teacher, he won the 2019 Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Stefan and Niigaan. Let's give them a warm round of virtual applause. Stefan, we will start with a question for you. Please tell us about life for you and your family before the Holocaust.
I was born in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, in the late 1920s. The majority of more than 300,000 Jewish people in Warsaw were not well off. They eked out their living, followed a Jewish way of life, and spoke Yiddish. They wore distinctive black clothing. Jewish children wore similar dress. Anti-Semitism was rampant, and many Jewish youngsters were beaten by the anti-Semitic Polish youth on the way to school. My family was among a small percentage of the Jews who were assimilated and better off. My father was a chemical engineer and my mother a school secretary. We lived in a nice apartment and spent vacations at the Baltic seaside or in the Carpathian Mountains, where we often enjoyed meeting our relatives. We spoke only Polish. We were deeply immersed in Polish culture, and some members of my family held strongly patriotic sentiments for Poland. I was aware of the importance of Palestine in the aspirations of some Jewish people. Although I was aware that I was Jewish, it did not really affect my life very much. My childhood was a happy one.
Thank you, Stefan. Niigaan, I now invite you to please tell us about life for your family prior to colonization and residential schools.
So, I mean, this is, it's a little bit hard to do the pre-contact because I wasn't around, and nor was anyone that I know or anyone that's living. But before, I've got just a couple pictures I'm going to show you in just a second, but you know, when we begin to talk about indigenous civilizations, we have to realize that there is not 1 inch of this place we now know as North America, we refer to it as Turtle Island, that was not covered, claimed, lived upon, engaged with by indigenous peoples. Every single speck, every single tree, every single river was traveled by Indigenous peoples on some way at some point. I mean, you got to think about the fact that we're talking about, if we just follow anthropological points, we're talking about 30,000 years, but we're more talking about millennia. So as a result, it's very hard to sort of encapsulate what would it been like for my family. But, you know, our families before we had this place called Canada, or the place in which people came to this place, was not a perfect one, but it was certainly one in which we were self-sustaining peoples. We were peoples who spoke fluently our language. Obviously, we spoke nothing else. We were families that took care of ourselves. We were what we called egalitarian. Like, there is no such thing as an Indian chief. That is a made-up word. We don't have chiefs. What we had is we had certain people in the community that were denoted as leaders, but we often had thousands of them, hundreds and thousands of them. So like there was no one chief of a community. There were thousands of chiefs that were spread throughout, all different ages, all different genders, all different sexualities. You know, like we had many different ways in which our community operated and developed. But we were self-sustaining people. So what I want to show you is a picture of my great-grandparents. And the reason why I want to show that right now is because my great-grandparents are the entire reason that I'm here today. Here they are right here. Their names are Catherine Simard, and Henry Louis Sinclair. And you can see them just to the left there. And the house that you can see behind them was built on the Red River. And that way back in the day, back in the 1910s, 1920s, Henry built that house himself by hand with no machinery. He built that literally himself, which tells you a lot about our people. Our people were remarkable, remarkable people who were ingenious in the ways in which we could use the land. We used the food. Henry was a fisherman. He spent his entire life building canoes for money, building them for other people, building boats. And then he, to feed the family, would be a fisherman on the Red River. So if the fish were plentiful, the family ate well. If they were not, then the family took care and had a garden in the background. And that's what our people were like. You know, it's not to say at this point in the 1910s, 1920s, that non-Native people, non-Indigenous peoples weren't around. Of course they were. But at this point in our family's history, like we had been for centuries previous, we were self-sustaining people. We were fully together, absolutely 100% together. And the evidence of that is on the right-hand side of your screen. You can see a picture of my grandfather and his brother Elmer. So the younger one is Henry Jr. And so that's my grandfather. And then his older brother is Elmer. And they grew up in that exact house that my great-grandfather built, in clothing that my great-grandmother sewed for them. And they were a happy family. They were a family that had a remarkable amount of love and kindness and generosity. They took good care of one another. They were people who spoke fluently Cree and Ojibwe in the home. And there were also people who had an entire system that looks completely different to what we would think of as the nuclear family, like 2 parents and 2 children. There were 14 children, and what the older children would take care of the younger children. And it would be like this sort of network and layers of family taking care of one another. Now, all of that changed when we get to this place right here. This is a very dark and terrible time in my family's history. But I think we want to just move on to the next question. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. Thank you so much, Niigaan. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe, which amounted to approximately 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Stefan, I invite you to please tell us now about life for you and your family during the Holocaust.
Soon after Germany invaded and occupied Poland in 1939, Germans issued orders against the Jews. There were signs, Jews forbidden, in parks and other areas. Jews had to wear a band with the Star of David on their arm. Germans ordered that brick walls be built across streets to enclose a section of the city where most of the population was Jewish. In the fall of 1940, all Jews were ordered, under the penalty of death, to move into the part of the city surrounded by the brick walls. This became the Warsaw Ghetto, and it was sealed from the rest of the city. The conditions were horrendous. Its population, which reached close to 500,000, was confined to an area of less than 1.5 square miles. Germans oppressed Jews, killed some, took others for heavy labor, but mainly starved them. Starvation and disease, with the epidemic of typhus transmitted by lice, led to thousands of deaths monthly. Corpses were lying on the streets. Yet life did go on. Although Germans closed all schools, there were secret schools with teaching in small groups of students. I was in such a group. Underground newspapers and literary works were produced, and cultural activities took place under difficult conditions. In July of 1942, Germans ordered transports from the Warsaw Ghetto with Jewish people loaded in cattle cars. The trains went to the death camp of Treblinka, where close to 300,000 Warsaw Jews, women, men, and children were murdered in its gas chambers by late September, including my parents. Nazis also murdered there around 600,000 other Jewish people from various parts of Poland and a number of European countries that they occupied. In October, I left the ghetto with a group of Jewish workers who labored in the Polish part of the city to meet my cousin. He lived in the Polish part of Warsaw using false documents as a non-Jew. He arranged for me to be hidden in apartments of Polish people because it was not safe for Jews with Jewish facial features to move freely. Anti-Semitic Poles were good at recognizing Jews and would blackmail them or turn them over to the Germans. I survived with false document as a non-Jew owing to my cousins, their parents, and the righteous Poles who helped the Jews, and with a lot of luck.
Thank you, Stefan. From the 1870s until 1996, more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were placed in residential schools across Canada. Niigaan, I invite you to now please tell us about life for you and your family during this time period.
Yeah, miigwech. So just a big thanks to Stefan for sharing that. Yeah, it's hard to talk about these things because we are talking about children and we're talking about violence. So miigwech to Stefan for that. So I'm going to show a few images again. But in order to understand residential schools in my family's history, you have to understand something that happened here in Manitoba. And a lot of you will not have known about this. You certainly will not have been taught this in your textbooks or in the history of Manitoba. But from the time period of about 1870, when Manitoba was made a province, the Canadian government systematically came into Indigenous communities and removed people. And what they did is they forcibly, by gunpoint, using the police, and laws passed by Ottawa remove people from territories. One of those communities that was removed was mine. And while you'll hear many communities, by the way, that are still being removed today for Manitoba hydro dams in the north, people have their communities flooded out. That history has not stopped. Indigenous communities are still being removed off their homelands and their territories today in 2022. But in 1907, the government of Canada with the town of Selkirk and the province of Manitoba came together to decide to remove us off our territory. So you can see here Lake Winnipeg right here. This is, if you just go down this river right here, this is the Red River right here. You go all the way to actually, there's a better map right here. You can see here, here's Winnipeg right here. This is our original site of our reserve right here. Now, we were a happy, self-sustaining people. We were people who, in many cases, actually decided to become Christians. We spoke English because we were getting used to the fact of living with non-Indigenous peoples. And so what we were experiencing is we were experiencing what we might call a naturalization of contact, or another word to describe that is treaty. People who share treaty. We were living under a treaty that had been made 90 years earlier called the Selkirk Treaty. And the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty. It was negotiated between Chief Peguis, who was the chief of our community, and several different ones on the Red River, and a man who the town of Selkirk would later be named called Lord Selkirk. He was a representative of the Hudson Bay Company. And people were living together. In fact, this is how important the family, the communities were learning from one another. Peguis decided to take an English name. He decided to take the name William to honor the priest who was at the Anglican church that was at St. Peter's. He respected him so much, he said, I will take your name. And he took the name William as his first name. And then he asked Lord Selkirk, he said, what's the name of your leader? What's the person that you answer to? And he said, well, that's the king. And Chief Peguis said, well, I shall take the name William King then. And that was his English name, William King. And his son were subsequently named princes. In fact, there's a really popular singer named Will Prince, who is, you can catch him on, he has a MasterCard commercial, he has CDs and things like that, but he's the great-great-great-grandson of Chief Peguis. Anyways, so back in St. Peter's, we were self-sustaining people. We were the most successful agricultural, we're better farmers than anybody, far better than any of the non-Indigenous peoples. We were the most successful farming settlement. Many of us were Christians, many of us spoke English, but still we were not good enough. And in 1907, the government of Canada forced us off the land by gunpoint. They tricked our leaders by forcing them to sign a document called a surrender document, and they forced us to move north from there. Now, the reason why that resembles, or that's important, is because that impacted my great-great-grandparents. They were forced to leave the very house that they had built, and then come back and purchase some of their own land. But in the meantime, they moved to a place called Fort Alexander, which is also known as Seguin. And one of the things that they did by moving to that territory is they had to put their children in residential school. Like all First Nations children, we were forced to send our children to residential school. In that place, this wonderful two boys right here, Elmer and Henry, experienced incredible pain, incredible, terrible, terrible things that I have difficulty speaking about. As you could tell, I start to choke up a little bit, because these young men who were growing up to become fishermen, to become people who worked in the land, people who spoke their language, quickly learned that those things were not acceptable in residential school, and they were often beaten, hurt, they were harmed. In fact, Henry, who's the younger one right there, just before this picture was taken, around about that time, he was trying to lift pails of water to help the other boys in the field, because what would happen in residential schools is you'd have to work 16 hours a day. And you sometimes went to school a little bit here and there, but you generally worked all day. And so another word for that, by the way, is called slavery. Indigenous children were slaves in residential school because they would have to work to raise money for the school in order to ensure their own servitude, meaning that the money that they sold for their produce or the things that they sowed Those things would have to be then later sold to produce money for the residential school to continue. But anyways, when Henry was bringing water out to the boys, he happened to spill one of the pails. And what happened was that the priest, who was the Catholic priest at this school, didn't like that, didn't appreciate Henry, said, "What's wrong with you?" And he beat him so badly upside the head that he permanently lost hearing in his left ear. And when that happened, my grandfather began to change. Not only could he not hear out of that side of his head, but he also got labeled a troublemaker because he couldn't hear things. And so he'd often act out in schools. And so what would end up happening was my grandfather never really did very well in school. So he decided at the age of 14 to go and fight in World War II. And when he went to go fight in World War II, he went to the grounds in France. And at the grounds in France at the age of 14, carrying a weapon in a country that hated him so much and treated him so badly that they would make schools led by people like that priest that would hurt a child. He decided to fight for it anyways. And for people like Stefan and for people like others, my grandfather fought and was deeply wounded in battle. He was hurt, shot. He was shot so badly that he was in a coma for 3 months in England and sent to a hospital in England. But unfortunately, he had to watch the horrendous battles on the grounds in France. And I wish that I pray that none of you ever have to experience the things that he had to see as a young 14-year-old boy, to see the things that he saw. And luckily, he was able to regain his health and return to come back to Canada. But that's not really where the story ends. And so I want to just finish by saying that for the rest of my life, for the rest of my grandfather's life, he suffered from the traumas from residential schools because he had experienced not just abuse from that priest, but he'd also experienced the violence of being told he was not worthy, that he was not good enough, that he was never smart enough, meaning while he couldn't hear out of that left side of his ear. And so he went into war and he became a hero in so many different ways, but he also became someone who was highly, highly damaged. When he came back to Canada, nobody wanted to hire him. The only place that he could get a job was working in the mines up north, and where he made pennies and pennies in very dangerous work. And one day he was involved in a collapse of the mine up in Flin Flon, and he was permanently injured for the rest of his life. And he began to live in the downtown Winnipeg core. We can see a picture right there, right about that time that he was living in the downtown area. And he began to try to cope with the fact that right about that time, he started to have children with his partner, and the partner that he loved and he cared about for all of his life died while giving birth to my Uncle Buddy, the fourth child of their family. So these 4 children right here, this is my Auntie Diane, my Uncle Richard, this is my Uncle Buddy, Henry Jr., and this is the great Senator Murray Sinclair, who has later become the head of the TRC. And he had to give up the children after his wife passed away because he could not raise children where he had never had parents himself. And he began to drink and try to cope with the pain of what he experienced. Because later in my life, it only became in 2004. So 14, sorry, in 2014, we finally found out that my grandfather had been sexually abused in residential school. And that's a very hard thing to talk about, but it's also something that he never shared with us. And this is my father right here, who held the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so we had no idea that my grandfather had been sexually abused in residential school. We had no idea. And so all of this alcoholism and sleeping on the streets, and when we drive through the north end of Winnipeg, every single person I see there resembles my grandfather in some way. It's a beautiful, brilliant person who is going through a hard time and have had experiences probably in their youth, or certainly when they're upbringing, the trauma and things that had happened have impacted them for the rest of their life. And so I'll stop there because I can talk more about recent times, but I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing that difficult history, Niigaan. Stefan, I invite you to please tell us about life for you and your family after the Holocaust. Specifically, what have been the legacies of the Holocaust for you and your community?
Soon after the war ended, I found my uncle and aunt in the city of Krakow in southern Poland, where I finished high school. Then in 1946, we proceeded to Munich, where I spent 2 years. I took some university courses. My relatives emigrated to New York, and I was sponsored by the Kitz's family to Winnipeg in 1948. I took medicine, which led to a medical career at the University of Manitoba and St. Boniface Hospital. In 1980, I joined the Holocaust Awareness Committee, and since then participated in events aimed at promoting the knowledge about the Holocaust. It's essential not only to remember its victims, but because of the recurring genocides and to counteract anti-Semitism, racism, other genocides and injustices.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Niigaan, what have been the legacies of residential schools for you and your community?
I feel like I'm taking up too much time with my answers. Okay, well, I have more pictures. One of the hardest things has been for me, for understanding residential schools, is that for Indigenous peoples, residential schools never ended. Meaning that while the schools have closed in 1996, the legacies that have come from parenting, from addictions, from trauma that happened even after the residential schools ended, or what I like to say is that the trauma of being removed from your lands, the trauma of being placed in schools and told that you're inferior, the trauma and the violence and the genocide that takes place following that, which is that you continue to feel unworthy, you continue to feel pain. And what ends up happening is this right here, all of these different things that haunt our elders, but then are passed on to us when they come home. This is my dad right here. And my dad is a beautiful, wonderful man, but he didn't start out that way. My dad, he was always very scared of his own father, because the only thing that he knew about his father was that he was an alcoholic and that he was very violent. And he would often relive the war, but he would particularly relive the pain that he had experienced losing his wife, my dad's mother, and that he had experienced that great amount of pain. And when this picture was taken right here, this is just after the children were sent to live with the same parents that my grandfather was sent, his parents, Henry Lewis and Catherine Samard. And so my great-grandparents saved my father and my uncles and my aunt's life, because they created a child welfare system in their own home. And that when my grandfather couldn't care for the children any longer, they took them in. And so we were one of the lucky ones in that we had family that could care for other family. But many Indigenous children, they didn't have that. They didn't have the ability to have other family members take good care of them. What they did end up doing is they ended up in the child welfare system, and they ended up with, in some cases, abusive families, in some cases, very loving families. But I don't care how loving a non-Indigenous family is, if they are non-Indigenous, there will always be the questions for Indigenous children of who am I and why am I here and what is my culture and where did I come from? And so it really doesn't matter how loving a non-Indigenous family is, there will always be questions for Indigenous children. And so that will lead many Indigenous children to ask the question of who am I? Now, for my father for many years, when he became a father, he also ran from us. He had difficulty too with alcohol. He had difficulty with pain. He particularly still has difficulty with really basic things that we take for granted, like hugging or saying, I love you, or spending time and sitting and visiting. For my father, those things are very difficult because for his time when he was a young man, all he knew is a lot of violence around him and a lot of pain and a lot of, you certainly never told somebody that you were loved. And if you did get touched, it would often be through violence and through touch, through striking, through hitting. And so for my father, he had a great deal of problems fathering himself. And it's been a whole lifelong journey for him to try to become a dad, to try to learn how to become a dad. And it is only now when he's retired, that he's now in his 70s, where he's finally able to sit and visit with us and spend time with us. And he spent a whole lifetime working very hard to search for that journey. He went to ceremonies, he worked on his language and his culture, and he did incredible things like lead major investigations into Indigenous peoples in the justice system. He headed up an entire investigation into residential schools, all in part because he was wanting to answer the question of who am I and how can this help me understand my experience and who I am. And at the same time, he also brought an entire country with him. And so my father did this with a great amount of pain, but the biggest journey for him is to become a dad himself. And you can see that here's me right here when I was very young. And it's been a very hard journey for him to become a dad. And finally, now when he's becoming a dad now, he's the best dad in the whole world. It took him a long time to get there, but it was through a great deal of pain and suffering that he was able to get through that experience into today. And so I'll end off there.
Thank you very much, Niigaan. We're now going to talk about racism. Stefan, what is the link between the Holocaust and racism?
Well, there are definite analogies. The provisions of the Indian Act are reminiscent of the Nuremberg laws that deprived Jews of their rights as citizens. Nazis considered Jews as subhuman. Canadians deemed the indigenous people to be savages. Nazis confined Jews in the ghettos and concentration camps, whereas the indigenous people and the youth were placed on reserves and in residential schools. There were death marches. For example, when the Soviet armies were approaching Auschwitz, Germans marched the remaining prisoners for hundreds of kilometers toward Germany, shooting those that were unable to keep up. Similarly, in the United States, indigenous people were forcibly marched in horrific conditions from eastern parts to the relocation sites in the West, many dying en route. I do not know whether that occurred in Canada. Niigaan might be able to tell us.
Thank you, Stefan. Niigaan, from your perspective, what is the link between the Holocaust, residential schools, and racism?
Well, when Adolf Hitler was studying what to do with Jewish people, he studied the reserve system that Canada and the United States had invested so deeply in to cordon off a group of people to try to control them and then later exterminate them. And so it's notable to tell every single young person today that there is a direct line that goes between the Holocaust and Indigenous experiences here in Canada. The question that people often say is, well, Indigenous peoples didn't experience the deaths like the Jews did during the Holocaust. Absolutely, within that time period, in that fixed time period of World War II, certainly Indigenous peoples did not experience the kind of deaths, but instead we experienced deaths over 150 years. And a genocide isn't just a genocide because it happened during 5 years. It can also happen during 150 years when you can take a people and systemically starve them, which is what happened when we were put onto reserves, put them in terrible living conditions, take away their children and put them into other schools. By the way, the section C of the definition of genocide is the forcible removal of children from one group to another. So residential schools are undoubtedly the definition of genocide, period. There's no debate here. It is absolutely the definition of genocide. And then on top of that, when you can then put people in dire living conditions afterwards, which are that they're ashamed of themselves, that they're in addictions, dealing with the traumas, that the violence that they've experienced. And then on top of that, and then also put them in a situation in which there's no hope. And in many downtown city cores, for many people, because of the racism put around them, like people would never hire a disabled veteran or a disabled hard of hearing Indigenous man. He has to go work in the mines up north. There's no hope for him. When you're born in Charleswood, you have things that you have inherited that you don't even know about. Like you have opportunity that people have that don't have, that are living in other areas of the city. Well, I can say the same thing about Tuxedo. I can say the same thing about River Heights. I can say the same thing about all different neighborhoods here in Winnipeg. You have opportunity that you have been born into by sheer luck. People who are living in other areas of the city don't have that opportunity. And so there is a direct correlation between the systemic extermination of Jewish people throughout Europe in World War II, and frankly, anti-Semitism, both before and after the war. We're seeing the most. There's no coincidence that we're seeing the most deeply anti-Semitic acts right now taking place in Ukraine, and we're also seeing deep hatred towards Indigenous peoples in sports mascots, in everyday society, in when Indigenous peoples try to stand up on their own lands, and the Canadian government sends in the army and the RCMP to remove them off their own lands for a pipeline. There's no coincidence that those events are happening at the same time, because the rise in racism globally has a lot to do with land, resources, and money. And back in the day, there's a reason why Jewish people were stereotyped as having all the money and all the power, therefore we have to exterminate them. And that Indigenous peoples have all the land, have all the power, we have to exterminate them. And that is exactly what happened to my community and is continuing to happen today. It just happens to be called for Canada's economic agenda, or pipelines, or et cetera, Manitoba hydro dams in the north, and et cetera. So these things have direct correlations and connections. But I also want to just talk about, I'm sure we'll have at some point to talk about today, and some hope today too, that we're seeing some remarkable abilities for people to enact that and engage that racism, because we all have a duty to play within when we encounter it.
Absolutely. We're getting there. Another shared experience when we think about the Holocaust in residential schools is slavery. And so Niigaan, let's start with you. You mentioned this earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about the link between residential schools and slavery?
Well, to be completely honest, I mean, your Karlee and a woman named Ann Lindsay are the ones who have really done this work. And so I'm very lucky that I get to work with great researchers like Karlee and Ann. But I will tell you that, until 1950, residential school children who were sent to sites had to work for the entire, there was no law that said that you had to take class. So what was often happening is churches were underfunding, they were given a pocket of money to run residential schools. And instead of running the residential school, the churches would take that money, they would do other things with it, building churches, trying to missionize and evangelicalize other people, spreading other, bureaucracy and offices and pay people. And they would take a little pot of that money left over and build the school, which meant the school was built poorly. The school was built in such a way that there was poor ventilation. Often diseases would happen in the school. They wouldn't feed the children properly, so the children were often starving. Or if they weren't starving, they would get very sick from tuberculosis because they weren't eating properly. And then on top of that, children were stuck in environments in which they had to fundraise for the schools, because the schools didn't have any money to run their own programming because they were too busy using it for other things. And the churches were basically mismanaging the money and using it for their own purposes and exploiting children as a result. Well, what does that end up being? Until 1950, children at many residential schools were working up to 16-hour days. They would wake up in the morning at 8 in the morning. They would work sometime, they would work sometimes up until 8 at night, 9 at night, depending on what they were doing within the residential school. And they get up the next morning, do it again. And all the money, all the proceeds that they would have to work went right back into the school, meant that they didn't see any of that money. That is exactly what happened to African Americans in the cotton plantations, that they had no rights, they had no abilities to speak out, they certainly had no ability to resist, and that they were basically little parts of the machine to produce money for white slave owners. Just in this case, this happened to be priests and nuns and churches.
Thank you, Niigaan. To be clear, this constitutes clear slavery under international law and forced child labor as well. Stefan, can you tell us now about the link between the Holocaust and slavery?
Well, Nazis used Jews as well as other European people for hard labor, which led thousands of them to their deaths in factories to boost the war effort, digging fortifications, and to build the V-1 and the V-2 rockets in the latter parts of World War II. Also, in some concentration camps, they made prisoners carry heavy boulders from the bottom of the quarries to the top all day until they collapsed and died. I wonder if I can go back to remark on something related to what Niigaan said earlier. Would that be okay or not?
Absolutely.
Well, he was talking about the intergenerational effects of trauma and injustices and how it has happened. Well, it has happened to the Jewish Holocaust survivors and their families. As one of the Jewish authors wrote, for example, myself, my teenage years were spent in abnormal conditions, hiding, being on false paper, watching every step. So having missed that part, I was not a good parent, just as Niigaan said. And that is true of other Holocaust survivors. When the war started, I was an early teenager, but there were some Jewish infants who survived. They were a year or 2 years old, or just newborns, and they missed a lot of the normal family lives, and they were not equipped to be fathers. Certainly, I was not, and I have no doubt. I know for sure that I was not a good father. That just as Niigaan's father, it took him time to become a dad, not until he was advanced relatively in his age. The same has been true with myself. I've done many mistakes with my family, and only more recently have I been able to become a better father. I just wanted to add that, because there's quite a parallelism between what Niigaan said and my own experience.
Thank you, Stefan. Well said. The intergenerational effects are significant. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and my dad, he didn't have grandparents or aunts and uncles. And so we've also gone through that even in the third generation as well. So again, thank you for those comments. Belle alluded to denial and distortion in her opening comments. I want to now ask you both about those pieces. What advice do you have for how we can respond to Holocaust and residential school distortion and denial in a good way? Let's start with Niigaan.
Well, I don't have any pictures for this one, but it's remarkable to me how many people are still deniers today. There is a former justice minister in the provincial government who is adamant in the Manitoba provincial government And it just blows me away that this person had a decision-making ability over the lives of Indigenous peoples, because we know that Indigenous peoples are some of the highest percentages of peoples in the justice system, and that he is a thorough and adamant believer that residential school survivors have exaggerated their experiences, are seeking mostly money, and that they just aren't interested in any way of telling the true story of residential schools, which is that they all should be thankful that they learn things. They should all be thankful that somebody gave them some food. They should all be thankful that the white man brought them the tutelage and the education necessary to thrive in this world, or whatever else that needs to be said. As you can see, none of that is true. And did people learn skills during residential school? Absolutely. They learned how to play hockey, they learned how to sew, they maybe learned how to play the piano, or they maybe learned how to read the Bible. None of that replaces your parents. None of that replaces your relationship with the land. None of that replaces love. I don't care how much you learn piano. None of it replaces a hug from your mom. Like, none of it, not 1 second. And that any denier who wants to talk about, oh, why don't you tell the good story of residential schools? I just did. I just told you the good parts, which is you learned a little bit of skill, you learned a little bit of piano, a little bit of hockey. But like I said, you could have learned that in your own community. You could have learned that with people, Indigenous peoples who were empowered. In fact, my father tells stories of playing hockey on the lake, on the Red River, when it would freeze up outside of his home. They were playing hockey anyways. You didn't need to be experiencing residential schools to experience those things. In fact, residential schools were remarkably efficient in the ways in which they instilled shame and trauma. And as a result, the generations and pain that we see today, the trauma that we see in the justice system, the child welfare system, the fact that murder missing Indigenous women and girls today is one of the biggest epidemics of this country, the fact that we see more Indigenous men go, it's more likely as an Indigenous man you're going to go to jail than you're going to go to university. Or the idea that as a young Indigenous child, there's more children removed in the child welfare system than there ever was removed from residential schools. All of that is because of the violence and shame, the trauma that was instilled by the Canadian government in cooperation with the churches, overseen and supported by the Canadian public. And if some people go, hey, Niigaan, why are you so angry? I'm just stating the truth. There's no anger here. In fact, what I would say is that it is Indigenous peoples who are the most peaceful and the most kind. They are the ones who are the most interested in a relationship. It's Canada that continues to perpetrate more violence and more violence, giving violence to an answer to violence, saying, oh, why don't you just be happy? We're building jails for you. That's not a solution. And so, like, what we need to have wholesale supports, allyship, engagement, resistance, the remaking of systems, the rebuilding of languages and cultures, and most importantly, kindness. Like, it's amazing how the revolution begins with kindness. In this case, it doesn't begin with sending in the army or sending in the police to remove people off their territory. It doesn't result, and it certainly won't come from Ottawa. It certainly won't come from some kind of silly law that Ottawa wants to instill on all of us. The revolution comes from you and me being kind to one another. The fact that I get to listen to Stefan here tell such a powerful, wonderful story and be brave. You know, it takes bravery to do the things Stefan's talking about. I mean, he's talking about his own experiences, and to be kind and to give that to someone like myself and to all the people on this call. That's how we're going to create the revolution. It's by sitting together and loving one another.
Kindness and courage. Thank you, Niigaan. Stefan, what advice do you have? And also, what role can this upcoming generation of students here with us today play in facing this history?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. What advice do you have, Stefan, for how we can respond to denial and distortion?
Oh, okay, right. I think we need constantly to correct lies and retell the stories of what did take place. That's because, as the history shows, humanity does not learn from its past mistakes, and the good and the evil within our species are in the state of constant counterbalance. As the German Chancellor Angela Merkel stated during her visit to Auschwitz in 2019, these crimes are and will remain part of history, and this history must be told over and over again.
Thank you, Stefan. Education is so vital. Stefan, I'm going to ask you the next question here, and then I'll invite Niigaan to respond as well. What role can this upcoming generation of students here with us today play in facing this history?
Having learned the truth, they can resolve to challenge all narratives that contain misinformation. Perhaps they could also adopt a story of an individual survivor and recount it at appropriate occasions.
Thank you, Stefan. Niigaan?
I want to just show, I think this will be my last set of pictures that I show here. I just wanted to sort of begin to sum up my talk about the legacies. So here I am now becoming a father myself. I'm 46 years old. This is my history of learning how to be a father from a grandfather who had tremendous pain and suffering, a dad who experienced that pain and suffering firsthand and ran away from many, just like my grandfather did. And when I became a father, I too wanted to run away. And luckily, I had a wonderful, my daughter's mother, who helped me to understand that this pain wasn't just my own, it had come from other places and it come from legacies. But my grandfather did something remarkable when I was born. And one of the things that he did was he changed his life completely. He stopped drinking the day, well, not the day, but the time that I was born, a couple months after. He stopped drinking because he wasn't allowed to see me, because this guy right here, my dad, told my grandfather that he couldn't come around when he'd been drinking, and he would never see his grandchild. And my grandpa never had a grandson, so when he got to see me, it was a big deal to him because he never had a grandson. I'm still the only grandson that he's ever had. So for my grandpa, that was a really big deal. So he changed his life and he became a really remarkable, beautiful man in the last stages of his life. My dad has always been a beautiful man, sometimes not so beautiful to be the son of until very recently, but he is just a remarkable, beautiful man in every way. And he tried very, very hard. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my life is just be a good dad. Like, if that's all I do, then that's all I do. But something really remarkable has happened with this little girl right here, is that she's become like a leader in ways that I never would have become. Like she's excuse me, she talks about her culture, she speaks Cree, she's very proud of who she is. And I think if this story ends, if my story ends with that story, meaning that she can live love, she can see that being Cree and Ojibwe, being First Nations, is something to be very proud of. But something else is an important part of this as well, is that because I've been able to teach her love, she's been able to show love to others at a very early age. I never was able to do that, nor was my dad, nor was my grandfather, because we were surrounded by a great deal of pain and suffering, both at the schools and then later following that. And that we always wanted to run. My daughter never runs. So one of the things that's happened is that she's been able to build this incredible network of friends. And one time she said to me, she said, "Daddy, I want to dance jingle dress." You can see here that she's got her powwow outfit here. She says, "I want to dance at the school assembly." And I said, "Don't do that. That sounds like a terrible idea." What if somebody makes fun of you? What if a teacher says racist things to you? What if what if it's a terrible experience, like somebody yells out something, and she said to me, "Daddy, don't worry, my friends will get them." And I know that sounds silly, but at the age that she was grade 7 when she said that, she said, "Daddy, don't worry, my friends will always protect me." And her friends are non-Indigenous. Most of them are non-Indigenous. Some of them are Indigenous. But the amazing thing is because she's been able to create positive relationships with her friends, they've become allies and relatives, sisters and brothers. Or I guess also that there are also many of them are non-binary. So I'm not sure, siblings. And so what's happened with my daughter is that because of the love that she has gained from all these generations of really brave people in her life, my grandfather, my father, myself, and then we can't forget, of course, her amazing mother, all of her aunties, all of her other grandmothers as well, that she's been able to do things, not just because of herself, because she's brave too, but because of her friends around her. Her friends around her have stood beside her as allies, and they have said that we are not going to tolerate racism. We are not going to tolerate people who deny residential schools. We're not going to tolerate those who want to tell lies for their own political purposes. And it is amazing to me that we have premiers of provinces, we have ministers, we have CEOs, we have everyday people who are continuing to spread lies for their own purposes, to make fun of, to insult, to stereotype Indigenous peoples and other groups as well, because oftentimes when they're not just racist against Indigenous people, they're often homophobic, they're often anti-Semitic, they're often like the amazing thing about racism and sexism is that often these things are coupled together. They're often people who carry all of these at once. And it's through the bravery of standing with brave people. And that's what I encourage everybody on this call to do, is when you see bravery, don't turn away from that, stand with them. And that's where we're going to find allyship, and that's where we're going to live treaty. That's where we're going to be the people, the treaty people that we said we're going to be at the beginning of this call, the beginning of this presentation, when we said we're all treaty people, or we're on Treaty 1 lands. Being a Treaty 1 person means that we stand together. We don't let people be made fun of. We don't let people be cast aside and forgotten about or taken away to be killed. We never let that happen. We make sure that we care about each other at all times.
Thank you, Niigaan. I just saw a lovely quote in the chat that captures what you said. The young generation gives us hope. Stefan, I now want to move to you. What key message would you like us to take away from this conversation?
What message? Say that again, please.
What key message would you like us to take away from today's conversation?
Well, one thing would be to organize forums that deal with these and similar atrocious events and other injustices, and try to take tangible activities towards acknowledging and supporting other human beings and creatures with whom we share this planet. I think Niigaan very from the heart dealt with that very well. I can only second what he said.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Niigaan, for yourself, what key message would you like us to take away from this conversation?
So at this point in my life, I'm working with my dad on his memoir, his life story, and so I can't tell everybody enough. And this is something that was said to me when I was young, and I never listened. So I get it that you're probably not going to listen to this, but for many of you young people, but when you're around a person with the kind of knowledge like Stefan, really just like savor it, like realize, it's hard sometimes to hear the stories, right? It's sometimes hard to hear the trauma and to hear the pain of losing your parents or losing your relatives, like Stefan's talked about. Like I choked up hearing about that because, I've heard Stefan's story a few times. You can get his book, by the way, so you can learn about Stefan's life. It's a really amazing story. And so, but when you're around these kinds of stories, really like take the time. It's worth it. I promise you that it's worth it. It's like sitting with a fire. Like, how like you walk by a fire and you're like, it's just a fire. I'll see another one. But then when you sit with a fire, and there's a reason why as Anishinaabe, we call Ishkade our grandparent. Like we refer to it as our grandparent, because when you sit with a fire, every fire is different and every fire has beauty. There's senses, there's stories, there's songs that you can hear by listening, by watching, by smelling that fire. And that you all like notice that whenever somebody sits by a fire, they always just sit. Like notice that they don't do anything else. They'll look at the fire. Like people will sit. There's something magical about a fire that will entrance, will enlighten, will enchant you, will excite you, will help you to learn. And that's what it's like to sit around people like Stefan, to hear that fire, to experience that fire. And my father is a similar person. If you get a chance to spend time around my father and hear his stories and hear his experiences. And many of our grandmothers, have been spending their whole life collecting stories, and for us to share that. So that's my first message is to, really savor that time that if you get a chance. And I know I heard that when I was a kid and I didn't listen either, but now that I'm 46, man, do I ever wish I could go back and hear some of my relatives that have passed away, like my grandfather who passed away when I was 17, but I got to spend a little bit of time with him. So the second thing is having the bravery of kindness, the courage of love. It's the revolutionary, and the revolution is love, right? That's where the revolution will and always will be. Sometimes love is not always, I'm talking about kind of the Hollywood romantic stuff. I'm talking about the bravery of standing beside somebody, the bravery of choosing to believe, with having integrity, having ethics, being moral. Just, when you wear a mask these days, that is an ethic. You're taking care of others. It's not about yourself. It's about taking care of others. That's why we socially distance and we take good care. We make sure that we, take care of the medicines, or we take care of our bodies. The last thing is what I would say is know that the revolution is not over. The battles are not over. I mean, right now we see young people who are under attack in Ukraine. And what is the language that's being used? It's anti-Semitic language, saying things like, "Oh, all those Ukrainians are Nazi sympathizers," or they're whatever else that they're saying in Ukraine. And so oftentimes the racism continues throughout the world. We may also be seeing a renewal of racism in certain political movements. The so-called Freedom Convoy was very closely linked with many images that were anti-Semitic and anti-Indigenous. And so we're seeing a rise, particularly in the Southern United States, of a kind of mainstream racism that we thought was going away, but is still coming back. So know that in your lifetime, you're going to have to face this. And one of the most driving forces to this, of this rise in racism, is because the world is running out of resources. The world is running out of water and land, and we can't eat money. And so as we begin to run out of water and land, people will begin to become more and more divisive and use things like race to remove people off the lands, which, by the way, is nothing new, but it may just be a renewal because we have a challenge in that we only have so much water in the world, so much earth in the world. And so we need to make sure that we include everybody, that we consider everybody, and we don't let discourses or stories or ideas of racism creep into our mindset. And that may just be the most important message of all from today.
Well said, Niigaan. I have one last question for you both. Do you have hope for the future? If so, what is it that gives you hope? Stefan?
You're talking about truth and reconciliation?
That's certainly part of it. If you have hope for the future, what is it that gives you hope, Stefan?
What would I like for people to take away from it? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Well, I think that people need to be well acquainted with these events that we have been talking about, and importantly, to be able to attain this objective, develop the ability to think critically. That means that one ought to ask oneself whether or not what one reads or hears is likely to be correct, no matter what the source, teacher, newspaper, family, internet, or government agency.
Thank you, Stefan. We have some pictures on the screen here of you. Could you walk us through what we're seeing?
Regarding hope for the future, is that what
Yes, please.
you're talking to me?
Yes,
Yeah,
Stefan. Thank you.
okay. Well, frankly, it is very difficult to be optimistic, and I would like to show you. Can you see it?
Yes, the
Yes,
picture is
I
up,
can.
Stefan.
Yes? Okay. This is the memorial site in Treblinka, the graveyard of close to 1 million victims of the Holocaust. It's a large field with boulders which represent towns and villages of the victims. And this next picture, you can see, shows a stones. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned in the previous picture, you saw the field full of boulders, which represent towns and villages of the victims. And this second slide shows a stone structure there with engraved words, "Never again," in 5 languages. Now, as it was mentioned before, and these words have been used in other contexts as well. However, we know that the reality is rather again and again, as further genocides and grave injustices continue to happen. A prominent fellow Holocaust survivor published a book which he entitled "Humanity in Doubt." In addition, we, the human species, is faced with the possibility of a potential nuclear conflagration and the climate catastrophe. Yet, we must not give up. Pete Seeger, the renowned folk singer, said, "Think globally, act locally." He founded an organization that sought to reverse the pollution of the Hudson River in New York in 1966. They built the sloop named Clearwater, sailed it on the river, and stopped in towns along its shores. They gave concerts and promoted measures to combat pollution. And indeed, the river became clear. Everyone can try to fight injustices, help the environment, and promote mutual respect with other human beings and creatures with whom we share this planet. We can drive less, use less energy, recycle more, compost more, and indeed smile and say hello to people we encounter on a walk.
Well said, Stefan. And if you're interested, you can purchase Stefan's book titled "From Warsaw to Winnipeg, A Personal Tale of Two Cities."
I guess later this year we may have event for it, that I understand.
Yes. And so Niigaan, just giving you the chance as well here, what is it that gives you hope for the future?
No, I mean, Stefan, I think said it beautifully. I think I said it just a minute ago in terms of just thinking about the revolution of love and the revolution of kindness. One thing that I really encourage people to do is, you don't have to go out and march. Like you don't have to, some of us are activists and that's how we feel that we need to display and show our message. That's fine. I've been marching most of the marches back, 10 years ago. I was the one organizing all of them. So all those Indigenous marches downtown. But, the fact is that, loving each other, standing up for one another, learning and reading, becoming that critical citizen like Stefan was talking about, that's a part of the revolution too. That's a part of changing this world. Like I know some of you saw my cat walking around. There she is over there. She's having a nap. But it's part of me growing as a person is I've had to learn how to be kind. And part of that is learning my relationships and taking great care with my relationships and really working hard at it. And so so part of that is, me learning about having, when I got my cat, it was part of me just learning. We had to learn to trust each other. She grew up in a very difficult situation. And so I had to learn how to be kind with her. And so she taught me patience and she taught me about generosity. And she's also taught me about commitment, like don't give up because we don't trust each other at the beginning. It's amazing how many life lessons I've gotten from a cat. And I know that sounds silly, but it's gotten me to be a better person, a better father, a better person in the community, because I've started to think a lot about that is the message that I think many of us have forgotten or many have not been given an opportunity to learn about Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, is that it takes time, it takes patience, it takes generosity. And no one is going to start off by being friends when you've got all of this violence and trauma and anger behind us. Because what happens is people don't trust each other because of good reasons. There's good reasons that they don't trust. There's good reasons that Indigenous peoples don't trust the police. There's good reasons that Indigenous peoples don't trust government. That's not the fault of Indigenous peoples. That's the fault of government, police, and others who have hurt Indigenous peoples in the past. And none of that is our fault, but it is our inheritance. That means that when we work together, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. It's going to take time for all of us to grow and to begin to grow, to become a better community. But we do that if we stay at it, if we stay committed to it. And so I see that all the time. Like I see more teachers teaching about residential schools, teaching about Indigenous content and knowledge. I see more teachers being brave than I've ever seen in my life. I had teachers when I was growing up saying racist things to me all the time. They didn't know they were racist. They weren't racist people, but they learned racist things. I see more political leaders. This morning I had a meeting with the Forks National Historical Site about they want to change Canada Day into something that isn't just about talking about the flag, but also talks about all of our different cultures and communities and ideas around what Canada is. I work with several different institutions, the Winnipeg Free Press, the University of Manitoba, the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada. So I work with all these different institutions and they're working hard as well. So you're not alone. You're not alone in this movement. It will take all of us to change what has been 150 years. And it will take probably 150 years for us to change it fully.
Thank you, Niigaan. Speaking of teachers and students, I now invite everyone to listen to the trailer of a documentary that was made by Westwood Collegiate students from here in Manitoba who are active in the Westwood Historical Society.